Alleluia. Om Mani Padme Om. Allah Satnam.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Shinen Wong. He's the Education Officer for Spiritual Health Victoria. Thanks for coming back in, Shinen.
Thank you, Norm.
Spiritual Health Victoria, could you just give a bit of an idea, a bit of an outline of what that is?
Sure. So Spiritual Health Victoria is a peak body in the state of Victoria here in Australia, and we manage the ongoing professional development of spiritual care practitioners to ensure quality spiritual care provision in hospital, health and other welfare contexts. And we also provide resources and are sort of a liaison between the peak faith community councils and the health sector as well, in spiritual care provision.
Right. Well, that's a big brief itself, liaison between those bodies. Now, Education Officer.
That's right.
What do you do?
So my role is quite broad. At the moment, I manage two major projects, or programs. One is the ongoing monthly professional development program for spiritual care practitioners, which has an education component and a supervision component. And this program is actually done in partnership with two other organizations, ASPIA and SCA. So ASPIA stands for the Association for the Supervised Pastoral Education in Australia. Oh my goodness, I'm on camera. And SCA is Spiritual Care Australia. So the three of us, the three organizations in partnership, produce this program, and we are the main drivers of the program, and we manage the ongoing sort of administration and the budget stuff. Right. And it's run through a steering committee which has representatives from these other organizations. And we also have two representatives on the steering committee from the two largest non-Christian faith communities in Victoria, so a Buddhist representative and a Muslim representative from the Buddhist Council of Victoria, from the Islamic Council of Victoria. Yep. So with the steering committee, I manage the monthly education program. The program roughly looks like morning tea, followed by about 45 minutes of prayer and reflections, which are available to anyone from any spiritual perspective. There is a guest presentation, followed by lunch, and then followed by afternoon clinical supervision sessions with the practitioners.
That's quite a big brief to organise something like that. And you talk about a prayer session. What does that look like?
So we call it prayer, contemplation, and reflection, and the way it looks is actually dependent on who's running it on any given month. So the program itself is held at a different hospital each month, and is hosted by the pastoral care coordinator or the spiritual care coordinator or manager. The role titles change from hospital to hospital. So I work in connection with the pastoral care coordinators to support them in designing a 45-minute session for prayer and reflection. So it varies from place to place. Some people use specific religious teachings or particular rituals or particular prayers from a particular tradition, which is absolutely welcome, as long as two factors are true. One is that the tradition from which it is drawn is named explicitly, and then the second is that people are invited to participate regardless of their tradition. So it has to be an invitation, and so then people can choose for themselves. So with that level of clarity, it makes room for a variety of different faith and also non-faith or beyond faith-specific perspectives for quite a diverse group of people. Yeah.
That's a fairly remarkable achievement that you're doing that, because on my experience with interfaith groups, one of the issues is people praying together is one of the issues. So but the way in which you've managed that to be able to A, give people the option, and B, for the faith group who happens to be organising it to make a clear statement of to where and the purpose, I suppose, of their presentation. That's quite remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly can't say that I've done this by myself. This is a program that I've inherited. It's been going for at least over 20, possibly 30 years now, not in the same form. It's changed over this period of time. But yeah, it's an inheritance. And so I've just been working in connection with people to make sure that
it's as I say, it is remarkable. And these are the quiet little things, these quiet achieving programs in the background. That perhaps don't get as much publicity as perhaps they should.
I can agree with that.
Yeah, yes, I'm sure you would. So, what's the attitude of the various faith community coordinators, to call them that name? What are they like? Are they all enthusiastic and supportive of the process?
I would say that on the general level, that everyone is very supportive. At the head level.
Yes.
I think at the heart level, I think there is still the learning and the growing process, and part of what I'm noticing is the capacity for love and reflection that flows when people are actually in connection with one another in person.
Yes.
So it's beyond the level of abstraction. How do I relate to this other group? We need to go beyond that thinking. Because what ends up happening is once we're actually in the same room together, a lot of that stuff dissolves. A lot of the fears and the concerns and trepidations and apprehensions, they kind of melt away. Or perhaps more relevant apprehensions take their place. We actually deal with the real thing that needs to be dealt with, not some imagination of conflict. So, and that to me has been a real learning even for myself.
Yes, it is a particularly difficult place to be in, that one. Okay, so in the afternoon you have, what are they, workshops, are they? To do? Or,
so after the prayer, contemplation and reflection sessions, we have a guest presentation.
Yes.
And so the presentation involves different presenters from month to month, and the way that the decisions about who those are going to be and what the topics will be, those decisions are made with the steering committee that I mentioned that I'm a part of. But those decisions are contingent on the evaluations from the previous year's attendees as well. So people make recommendations of what topics they would think are relevant.
So it's a very organic process that's going on here.
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly been trying to make it much more transparent, the process of decision making. We try and keep it as democratic as possible and really ensure that all of the attendees, particularly people who are spiritual care practitioners, who have been in the field for a while, that their voices are reflected in the design of the education program.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. We'll go for a break.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony University, and we're speaking with Shinen Wong, who's the Education Officer for Spiritual Health, Victoria. And Shinen, we were talking about the two principal things you do. The second one is volunteer training. How does that work?
So I mentioned the professional development program. That's for existing spiritual care practitioners. So the other program that I manage is called the volunteer training program, spiritual care volunteer training program. And it's basically sort of like a vehicle as a pathway for people to become involved in the provision of spiritual care in hospital and health settings. Historically, the primary way that people come on board to volunteer or to become paid practitioners is by completing CPE, clinical pastoral education. Right. And we wanted to provide a framework that could be more accessible, particularly for people from non-Christian perspectives or non-Christian backgrounds who may not be as well resourced by the religious institutions to support volunteers in going through things. So the program that I manage at the moment, it comes in sort of three different parts. One is that I inherited a previous iteration of the volunteer program, and I consolidated it and made it more multi-faith accessible, and then we published it in a hard copy manual. So it was the writing of the manual and the publication of the manual. Then the other two things are that I train trainers to use the manual to train volunteers in their own contexts. In other words, I run a one-day training where I train pastoral care coordinators, congregation, volunteer trainers, people from the various peak faith community councils. I train them to take the manual back to their own context to train volunteers.
Yes.
So that's the other thing. And the third is there's an option for me to actually do the training of volunteers directly.
Yes.
Often many congregations or perhaps some hospitals may not have the capacity to do the training themselves, so then they can invite me to facilitate it on their behalf.
What would that look like? What your training of the volunteer? What are you actually training them to do?
So the volunteer training program at the moment is broken down into 5 different units, and each unit is about 2.5 to 3 hours long. So you can have it in 2.5 days. We can have it in 5 different days. The 5th unit is a supervision unit, so that only happens after the volunteers have had a chance for placement at a hospital or whatever other context they were going to do it. So I would be involved primarily in the training of the first 4 units, and the 5th unit would be done by a professional trained supervisor.
Right.
So the first 4 units, the training itself is a broad overview of spiritual care, the various frameworks that are actually used to give meaning to spiritual care, not only in the Australian context, but actually draw on the World Health Organization definitions of pastoral care and pastoral supervision and ritual and all of that sort of stuff. So we take standards that are both local and international, and it's a skills-based program. In other words, we don't train in theology, we don't train in religious doctrine, we invite those perspectives in the training if that's relevant for people's contexts, but those have to be on top of what's in the manual, not replacing anything that's in the manual.
Right. Okay.
So the manual focuses on the skills that are required for volunteers to provide spiritual care in their various settings. And the main skill that we really train in is sort of critical listening skills and storytelling and attending to the evolution and the emergence of people's stories at various times of need.
Yes.
So that's the 4 units, is the focus on frameworks of spiritual care and the skills, particularly active listening, active reflective listening, and attending to story.
Yes, the active reflective listening is the critical component, isn't it? Because you can't respond to someone unless you can hear them.
That's
what
right.
they're actually saying. Yes. So you mentioned something about an immersion program that you were also involved in.
That's right. So I've just spoken about the professional development program for spiritual care practitioners. I've mentioned the volunteer training program. Another program that we've run through Spiritual Health Victoria is actually in partnership with Stirling Theological College, which is part of the University of Divinity, and it's a multi-faith 6-day immersion program in pastoral care from various non-Western Christian perspectives.
Okay.
So those days are hosted by our council members. So in particular, the 6 days have been the Buddhist Council of Victoria hosts a Buddhist Immersion Day. The Sikh Interfaith Community Council, the Islamic Council of Victoria, the Hindu Council of Australia, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, and
one other.
Yes, one more.
Yes, you can cheat.
Oh, of course, the Jewish Community Council, absolutely.
Yes.
So those are the 6 communities that we're represented for the 6 immersion days. So it's a full day where we explore doctrine, we explore ritual, we explore belief, and then we explore the skills of actually attending to patients from those particular backgrounds, what sorts of rituals they might need. You know, if they have particular belief systems around death, dying, burial, cremation, things like this. As someone who might not be from that faith background, it would be really important for me to know how to address that, not only sensitively, but to really do justice to the integrity of the spiritual dimension that is alive in each and every one of us beyond our faith affiliations. So,
just on that point, that's a question that arises within me: is having running these immersion programs. Have you come out of that with an awareness of a common ground which permeates through them all?
I would say yes. On one level, yes. I mean, I actually think that our commonalities, stressing our commonalities is absolutely important. And of course, the immersion program exists contingent on that assumption. But it's also celebrating our differences, right? So it's being able to go into the specific nuances of our differences, to actually allow it to be different, to be like, I accept that I might
Yeah.
never understand this. And actually that is the common ground, the accepting of mystery, the accepting
Yes.
of unknowing, the accepting of, oh, I don't understand, and let's share our non-understanding and actually grow together in that way to be able not only to coexist, which is a little bit of a cynical term, maybe, but to really flourish in our unknowing, to flourish in our differences. So that is the place of the common ground that I've learned in encountering people.
Yes, you raise a very interesting point about the fact of allowing the mystery, allowing the non-understanding without panic, without anger, without fear. Time has gone again, so we need to fear the clock. We'll be back in a moment.
Mani Allah, Alleluia, Mani Allah.
Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Shinen Wong, who's the Education Officer for Spiritual Health, Victoria. We were talking about the various functions of the Educational Officer, which I believe we've covered most of it, but there were 2 points which I've noticed on the website, particularly for spiritual health. You do publications and research. The publications, what's the general range of that? How does that engage?
So we have a number of different publications that cover issues that would be relevant for practitioners, particularly around credentialing frameworks, competencies, things like this. One of the publications that I've worked on is the Multi-Faith Calendar, which looks at the various dates that it would be of relevance to major religious communities, major faith communities, so that people who work in spiritual care can just be aware of what's coming up, and there might be specific needs that patients might need on that in that period. So that's an example of a publication that's relevant for people.
And an important one, as you say, because they all overlap and there's all sorts of...
Yes, my understanding is that that's how we got into connection, is because the Multi-Faith Calendar went through one of your networks.
Exactly, exactly. So then research, there's a massive area for research. What's the sort of the scope of it?
So the scope of research is to really look into best practice for spiritual care that particularly attends to the changing landscape of public health in Australia and the health sector in Australia. A lot of the ways in which language is very medicalized, and so we're trying to bridge a type of, I won't call it a gap, but to sort of bridge, just to have a conversation, to keep the conversation going, and to create an evidence base for speaking about spiritual care that would be understood by people who come from more either secular or a medicalized relationship to health. That's right.
Right, right. Well, if we take that as the point where Spiritual Health Victoria, we close off on that. We've explored it, and you've got another passion, and that is the Asian Australian Democracy Caucus. Sounds great. Tell us about that.
Sure. So in my other life outside of Spiritual Health Victoria, I have a passion for democracy, particularly for working with Asian Australians here in Victoria. By nature of the category, as you might imagine, many of us have come from migrant backgrounds. Many of us, not all of us, but many of us, like myself, have come from migrant backgrounds, which actually, aside from being Asian, reflects the demographics of the broader Australian community quite strongly, with the added component of being Asian in particular. So the organization was founded by a group of my friends, and I am one of the conveners for the organization. And the mission or the vision of the Asian Australian Democracy Caucus, or the AADC, the mission of the AADC is to raise stock of civic knowledge and to increase democratic participation, or to increase participation of Asian Australians in democratic practices, sort of like democracy literacy, if you like.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Many of us may have come, or our families will have come from countries that are either new democracies or are not democratic. And I think there's an induction process, for myself included, in learning about the specific histories of Australia, and to really choose to be a part of it, not only to be an eternal outsider or to simply bear witness, but to really see ourselves as agents, as citizens of change in this country.
That's a very interesting perspective, because if the, like in the case of a migrant family, if the parents don't understand the true nuances of democracy in the Australian context, they're inhibited. And so what your idea is to try and break that down. Now, how do you do that? Do you run seminars? What's the process?
So we've been going for about 2 years right now, and we've been running ad hoc meetup groups when people from Asian and Australian backgrounds can get together. We're completely unfunded and volunteer run, so this is just the passion of us. And we get together about every 2 to 3 months, and we just have conversations about issues and topics that are relevant to us. You know, sort of topics that have been recurring have included just our stance on refugees and asylum seekers, people in offshore detention, things like this. Really considering solidarity with Aboriginal communities as well. Do we have a particular role to play as Asian Australians rather than white Australians in the national conversation around Aboriginal justice for Aboriginal communities, closing the gap in health disparities, all of that sort of a thing beyond a black-white binary. So what role do we have? Because we're not Aboriginal, but we are part of this history of the settlement of this country.
Yes.
So we, you know, what role do we have in that conversation? So that's, and it's important, I think, to begin that conversation with other Asian Australians, so that we can actually figure it out for ourselves before we present a more public voice on some of these issues.
Do you have any liaison with unofficial liaison with government departments or anyone at this point? Because it's
not at this stage, but we're not closed off to it. What I probably should stress as well that I haven't already is that we're completely non-partisan. So we don't formally affiliate with any political party, and we will work with different parties depending on you know, the issues of the day. That's or right. Particular issues. And it's important, I think, for our intellectual, philosophical, political integrity, cultural integrity, to actually, as a specific organization, to remain non-partisan.
Absolutely. Academic organizations, do you sort of have any input from specialists in universities, etc.?
Yes, actually, the AADC, the Asian Australian Democracy Caucus, actually came about because of conversations that had been happening with the Asian Australian Studies Research Network. Right. So that's a network that's been going on for at least 2 decades. I'm not the best historian on this as a newcomer to this country, but my understanding is that the Asian Australian Studies Research Network has been going on for 20 years, and it's a network of academics from across Australia who are interested in that intersection between Asia and Australia, Asian Australian studies. And so, yes.
Good. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
And we've come to the end. And Shinen, I'd love to thank you for a really insightful discourse on the Spiritual Health Victoria, and last week on yourself and on being an Asian in Australia.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Norm, for having me.
You've been watching Harmony and Diversity, and we'll be back next week. Bye for now. Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om, Allahu